April 15, 1945. British forces approach a seemingly quiet complex of wooden barracks in northern Germany. The guards who had ruled this place with absolute authority for years suddenly find themselves facing an impossible choice. Some attempt to blend in with prisoners. Others try to flee into the surrounding countryside. A few make desperate attempts to destroy evidence of their crimes. But for most, there is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no way to escape the consequences of what they had done. This is the story of the final 24 hours of the Bergen Belsen concentration camp guards, and how the perpetrators of one of history's most horrific crimes faced their final moments of freedom. By April 14, 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Soviet forces were fighting in the streets of Berlin, and Allied armies were sweeping across Germany from the west. For the guards at Bergen Belsen, the war they had thought would bring eternal victory was ending in defeat and disgrace. The camp had evolved from a prisoner of war facility into one of the most notorious concentration camps in the Nazi system. Originally established in 1940 to house captured Allied soldiers, it had transformed into a death camp where Jews, political prisoners, Roma, and other victims of Nazi persecution were systematically murdered. By early 1945, the camp held over 60,000 prisoners in conditions so appalling that death had become a daily routine. The camp's commandant, SS Hauptsturmführer Josef Kramer, had been receiving increasingly desperate communications from his superiors. The orders were contradictory and chaotic. Some messages instructed him to evacuate the camp entirely. Others demanded he eliminate all evidence of what had transpired within its barbed wire perimeter. Still others suggested he should somehow maintain normal operations despite the approaching enemy forces. Kramer had arrived at Bergen Belsen in December 1944, transferred from Auschwitz-Birkenau, where he had overseen the murder of hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews. His reputation for efficiency in mass murder had preceded him, and the conditions at Bergen Belsen deteriorated rapidly under his command. The camp's infrastructure, never designed to hold such numbers, had completely collapsed under the weight of constant arrivals and systematic neglect. Kramer, who had earned the nickname the Beast of Belsen for his brutal administration of the camp, found himself in an impossible position. The man who had overseen the deaths of thousands of prisoners was now confronted with his own mortality. His authority, once absolute within the camp's boundaries, was about to become meaningless. The guards under his command were experiencing their own crisis of confidence. These men and women, who had spent years dehumanizing and tormenting prisoners, suddenly faced the prospect of being held accountable for their actions. Many had joined the SS believing they were serving the greater good of the German nation. Others had simply followed orders without questioning their moral implications. Now, with Allied forces approaching, they were forced to confront the reality of what they had participated in. The guard force at Bergen Belsen consisted of approximately 800 SS personnel, including both men and women. Among them were veterans of other concentration camps who had been transferred to Bergen Belsen as the Nazi system began to collapse. These experienced killers brought with them knowledge of the most efficient methods of murder and torture. They had trained newer recruits in the techniques of systematic dehumanization that had become the hallmark of the Nazi concentration camp system. Many of the guards had become desensitized to human suffering through years of exposure to atrocities. They had learned to view prisoners not as human beings, but as problems to be solved through violence and elimination. This psychological transformation had been gradual but complete. The guards who now faced the approaching Allied forces were no longer the ordinary Germans they had once been. They had become something else entirely, participants in industrialized murder who had lost all connection to normal human morality. On the morning of April 14th, Kramer called his senior staff together for what would be their final meeting. The atmosphere in the room was tense and desperate. These individuals, who had once carried themselves with the arrogance of absolute power, now appeared diminished and fearful. They discussed various options for dealing with the approaching crisis, but no solution seemed viable. Some guards suggested they should fight to the death rather than surrender. Others proposed attempting to negotiate with the advancing British forces. A few even suggested they should try to present themselves as victims of the Nazi regime, claiming they had been forced to participate in the camp's operations against their will. Dr. Fritz Klein, the camp's chief medical officer, was particularly agitated during this meeting. Klein had been responsible for the medical experiments conducted on prisoners and had overseen the selection process that determined who would live and who would die. He understood better than most that his actions would be impossible to justify to the approaching Allied forces. Klein had arrived at Bergen Belsen with a background in internal medicine, but his medical oath had been perverted in service of Nazi ideology. He had conducted experiments on prisoners without anesthesia, performed unnecessary amputations, and participated in the selection of victims for elimination. His medical training, which should have made him a healer, had instead made him a more efficient killer. He understood human anatomy well enough to know exactly how to cause the maximum amount of suffering with the minimum expenditure of resources. The camp's medical facilities had been used not to heal, but to harm. Klein had overseen the injection of prisoners with various diseases to study their progression. He had performed surgical procedures without proper equipment or sanitation, knowing that the patients would likely die from infection. His medical records, which should have documented treatment and recovery, instead contained detailed notes about the most effective methods of causing death and suffering. Other senior guards included Unterscharführer Peter Weingartner, who had been responsible for the camp's administrative functions, and Rottenführer Karl Floratzich, who had overseen the prisoners' work details. These men had become experts in the bureaucracy of murder, managing the paperwork and logistics that made systematic killing possible. They understood that their detailed records and efficient systems had made them indispensable to the Nazi murder machine, but now those same records threatened to provide evidence of their crimes. The guards' desperation was evident in their increasingly erratic behavior. The camp's administrative staff was particularly concerned about the documentary evidence of their crimes. They had maintained detailed records of prisoner arrivals, work assignments, punishments, and deaths. These records, which had been essential for the efficient operation of the camp, now represented a comprehensive catalog of their criminal activities. The clerks and administrators who had prided themselves on their efficiency and attention to detail now realized that their meticulous record-keeping had created an unshakable foundation for their prosecution. As night fell on April 14th, the guards at Bergen Belsen faced a sleepless vigil. They could hear the distant rumble of Allied artillery and the drone of aircraft overhead. The sounds of approaching liberation for the prisoners were the sounds of approaching judgment for their captors. But the most chilling aspect of this final night was what was happening inside the camp itself. The guards, knowing their time was running out, began to make desperate decisions about what to do with the remaining prisoners and the evidence of their crimes. As dawn broke on April 15, 1945, the guards at Bergen Belsen were already implementing their hastily conceived plans. Some had spent the night burning documents, desperate to destroy any evidence that might implicate them in the camp's atrocities. Others had begun discarding their SS uniforms, hoping to blend in with the general population when the Allies arrived. The document destruction was being carried out with desperate efficiency. Guards fed personnel files, medical records, execution orders, and correspondence into furnaces throughout the camp. The smoke from these fires created a haze that hung over the compound, a physical manifestation of their attempts to erase the evidence of their crimes. However, the sheer volume of documentation was overwhelming. Years of meticulous record-keeping could not be destroyed in a single night, and much of the evidence was stored in locations that were difficult to access quickly. The guards responsible for the camp's financial records were particularly frantic. They had maintained detailed accounts of the valuables stolen from prisoners, including gold teeth, jewelry, and currency. These records documented a systematic program of theft that had operated alongside the murder program. The financial ledgers showed not only the scope of the theft, but also the efficiency with which it had been carried out. Guards had developed sophisticated methods for cataloging and distributing stolen goods, and their records revealed the extent to which they had personally profited from their victims' suffering. The most disturbing actions, however, were being taken by guards who believed they could somehow eliminate the witnesses to their crimes. Several guards attempted to poison food supplies destined for the prisoners, reasoning that dead prisoners could not testify against them. Others tried to sabotage the camp's water system, hoping to cause additional deaths that might be attributed to disease rather than deliberate murder. These final acts of violence revealed the complete moral bankruptcy of the guard force. Even faced with inevitable defeat and capture, they were willing to commit additional murders to protect themselves. The guards, who had spent years treating human life as worthless, continued to do so, even in their final hours of freedom. Their actions demonstrated that their participation in the Holocaust had not been reluctant obedience to orders, but enthusiastic participation in systematic murder. Some guards attempted to organize mass killings of the remaining prisoners. They reasoned that if no witnesses survived, they could claim that the camp had been a legitimate detention facility that had been overwhelmed by disease and overcrowding. These plans were ultimately abandoned, not because of moral considerations, but because the guards lacked the time and resources to carry them out effectively. The approaching Allied forces had compressed their timeline too severely for such large-scale operations. The guards' attempts to eliminate evidence extended beyond documents and witnesses. They tried to destroy the physical infrastructure of murder that had been constructed throughout the camp. Guard towers were partially dismantled, and some guards attempted to fill in the mass graves that contained thousands of bodies. These efforts were largely futile, as the scope of the physical evidence was too vast to be eliminated in such a short time. Irma Griesa, one of the most notorious female guards at Bergen Belsen, spent her final hours of freedom attempting to destroy evidence of her particularly sadistic behavior. Griesa had been known for her exceptional cruelty toward female prisoners, and she understood that survivors would be able to provide detailed testimony about her actions. She was seen burning personal belongings she had taken from prisoners and attempting to intimidate potential witnesses. Griesa's behavior during these final hours was particularly revealing. She had always taken pride in her appearance and her authority within the camp hierarchy. Now, faced with the collapse of the system that had given her power, she was desperately trying to reinvent herself as a victim rather than a perpetrator. She attempted to destroy photographs that showed her in SS uniform and tried to hide the whips and other instruments of torture that she had used on prisoners. Her attempts to intimidate witnesses were particularly desperate. She approached prisoners who had been subjected to her cruelty and threatened them with violence if they testified against her. However, these threats carried no weight now that her authority was evaporating. The prisoners who had once cowered before her now looked at her with contempt, understanding that her power was about to be permanently eliminated. Griesa also attempted to cultivate relationships with prisoners who might speak favorably about her treatment. She offered food and small privileges to prisoners who might be willing to testify that she had been kind or had helped them in some way. These transparent attempts at manipulation were met with disgust by prisoners who had witnessed her cruelty firsthand. They understood that she was trying to use their desperate situation to create false testimony that might save her life. The camp's administrative staff worked frantically to destroy records that documented the systematic murder of prisoners. They fed stacks of documents into furnaces, hoping to eliminate any paper trail that might connect them to specific crimes. However, their efforts were largely futile. The sheer volume of documentation was too great to destroy completely, and much of the evidence was already beyond their reach. Meanwhile, other guards were attempting more direct forms of evidence destruction. They tried to fill in mass graves and level areas where bodies had been buried. Some even attempted to exhume and burn corpses that had been hastily buried in recent weeks. These desperate actions revealed the full extent of their consciousness of guilt. Dr. Klein made perhaps the most calculating decision of all. He began preparing a false medical report that would claim the camp had been overwhelmed by a typhus epidemic that was beyond the staff's ability to control. He hoped this fabricated document would provide a medical justification for the massive death toll and absolve him and his colleagues of responsibility for the deaths. As the morning progressed, the guards' desperation became increasingly apparent. Some began approaching prisoners, offering them food or small privileges in exchange for promises not to testify against them. Others attempted to present themselves as protectors who had tried to help prisoners within the constraints of the system. The most pathetic attempts came from guards who tried to convince prisoners that they had been secret resistors all along. They claimed they had only followed orders reluctantly and had done what they could to minimize suffering. These transparent lies were met with contempt and disbelief from prisoners who had witnessed their cruelty firsthand. By midday on April 15th, the sound of approaching Allied vehicles was becoming unmistakable. The guards' final hours of authority were slipping away, and their increasingly frantic behavior reflected their growing panic. Some guards began fighting among themselves, with junior personnel blaming their superiors for forcing them to participate in atrocities. The camp's communication system had broken down completely. Guards were receiving no orders from higher authorities, and the normal chain of command had dissolved. This left individual guards to make their own decisions about how to spend their final hours of freedom. Some chose to flee into the surrounding countryside, hoping to escape before the Allies arrived. Others remained at their posts, either from a sense of duty or because they believed flight would only make their situation worse. A few guards even attempted to arm themselves, preparing for a final confrontation with the approaching forces. But perhaps the most telling behavior came from guards who simply sat in stunned silence, finally comprehending the full magnitude of what they had participated in. These individuals seemed to understand that their actions had been so heinous that no explanation or justification would be possible. The psychological breakdown of the guard force was complete. The men and women who had once terrorized thousands of prisoners were now themselves terrorized by the prospect of facing justice for their crimes. As the afternoon of April 15th, 1945 wore on, the guards at Bergen Belsen could hear the unmistakable sounds of British forces approaching the camp. Tank engines roared in the distance, and the voices of Allied soldiers could be heard giving orders in English. For the guards, these sounds marked the end of their world. The psychological impact of these approaching sounds was devastating for the guard force. Many had never heard Allied voices before, and the reality of defeat was crystallizing in their minds. The sounds of liberation for the prisoners were the sounds of judgment for their captors. Some guards began to break down completely, sobbing uncontrollably as they realized that their crimes would soon be exposed to the world. The camp's communication systems had been largely destroyed by the guards themselves in their attempts to prevent the Allies from obtaining intelligence about the broader Nazi camp system. Radio equipment had been smashed, telephone lines had been cut, and written communications had been burned. This self-imposed isolation meant that the guards had no way of knowing what was happening in the outside world, or what instructions they might be receiving from their superiors. The breakdown of communication also meant that individual guards were left to make their own decisions about how to respond to the approaching crisis. Some chose to maintain their posts, believing that military discipline might somehow mitigate their situation. Others abandoned their responsibilities entirely, either attempting to flee or simply collapsing under the psychological pressure of their situation. Commandant Kramer made one final attempt to maintain control of the situation. He ordered his remaining guards to form ranks and prepare to surrender in an orderly fashion. His plan was to present the camp's operations as a legitimate military installation that had been overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. He hoped that by maintaining military discipline, he could somehow minimize the consequences for himself and his subordinates. However, many guards had already abandoned their posts. Some had stripped off their uniforms and were attempting to blend in with the prisoner population. Others had simply walked away from the camp, hoping to disappear into the chaos of defeated Germany. The few who remained were largely those who believed they had no choice but to face the consequences of their actions. The guards who stayed behind spent their final hours in very different ways. Some continued their desperate attempts to destroy evidence, feeding documents into fires and trying to eliminate any trace of their involvement in the camp's operations. Others sat in stunned silence, perhaps finally comprehending the full scope of what they had participated in. Irma Grisi made one last attempt to intimidate prisoners who might testify against her. She approached several women who had been subjected to her particular brand of cruelty and attempted to convince them that they would be better off remaining silent about their experiences. Her threats, however, carried no weight now that her authority was about to be permanently removed. Dr. Klein spent his final hours as a free man attempting to complete his fabricated medical report. He hoped that by presenting the camp's massive death toll as the result of uncontrollable disease, he could avoid responsibility for the systematic murder that had actually taken place. His medical training, which he had perverted in service of the Nazi regime, was now being used one final time to create lies that might save his own life. The guards' behavior during these final hours revealed the full extent of their moral bankruptcy. Having spent years dehumanizing others, they had ultimately dehumanized themselves. They were now capable of any deception, any betrayal, any act of cowardice that might help them escape the consequences of their actions. As the British forces drew closer, some guards made last-minute attempts to present themselves as victims of the Nazi system. They claimed they had been forced to participate in the camp's operations against their will, and had done what they could to help prisoners within the constraints of the system. These transparent lies revealed their complete disconnection from reality. The final hour before the British arrival was marked by complete chaos. Guards were running in all directions, some still trying to flee, others attempting to hide evidence, and a few simply standing frozen in place, unable to process what was happening to them. The disciplined military force that had once controlled the camp had devolved into a mob of desperate criminals. At approximately 3 p.m. on April 15, 1945, the first British tanks appeared at the gates of Bergen Belsen. The guards who remained at their posts raised white flags and attempted to surrender in an orderly fashion. However, the sight that greeted the British forces was so horrific that orderly surrender was impossible. The advancing soldiers were confronted with scenes that defied human comprehension. Thousands of corpses lay scattered throughout the camp, many in advanced stages of decomposition. The surviving prisoners were in such poor condition that many appeared to be living skeletons. The stench of death and disease was overwhelming. When the British forces entered the camp, they found guards who were still attempting to maintain the pretense that they were simply following orders. Some guards actually approached the British soldiers and attempted to explain that they had been doing their duty as soldiers and should be treated according to the Geneva Convention. The British response was swift and decisive. The guards were immediately disarmed and placed under arrest. There would be no opportunity for them to escape or to continue their deception. Their final hours of freedom had come to an end. When the British 11th Armored Division finally breached the gates of Bergen Belsen at 3 p.m. on April 15, 1945, they encountered a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The guards who had prepared for this moment with such desperate measures now found themselves face to face with the reality of judgment. The British advance had been rapid and decisive. The 11th Armored Division, commanded by Major General George Roberts, had been pushing through northern Germany as part of the final Allied offensive. They had received intelligence reports about the concentration camp system, but nothing had prepared them for the reality of what they would find at Bergen Belsen. The soldiers who breached the camp gates were hardened combat veterans who had seen the worst of warfare, but they were completely unprepared for the horror they encountered. The initial British reconnaissance had been conducted by a small advance party that had approached the camp under a flag of truce. They had been met by German officers who attempted to negotiate the transfer of the camp to Allied control. These negotiations had been conducted with an air of military professionalism that completely ignored the reality of what was happening inside the camp. The German officers had tried to present the situation as a standard prisoner of war camp that had been overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. Lieutenant Colonel Taylor, who led the advance party, had been initially skeptical of reports about the camp's conditions. However, as he was escorted through the compound, he began to understand the true nature of what he was witnessing. The sight of thousands of corpses scattered throughout the camp, combined with the condition of the surviving prisoners, made it clear that this was not a conventional military facility, but something far more sinister. The British soldiers' initial reaction was one of stunned disbelief. Seasoned combat veterans who had seen the worst of warfare were reduced to silence by the horror they encountered. Approximately 60,000 prisoners were still alive in the camp, but tens of thousands of corpses lay scattered throughout the compound. The guards who had created this nightmare were now forced to confront it in the presence of their captors. The stench of death and disease was overwhelming. Bodies in various stages of decomposition lay piled in makeshift morgues and scattered throughout the barracks. The surviving prisoners were so emaciated that many appeared to be living skeletons. Disease was rampant, and the sanitary conditions were so appalling that British medical personnel immediately recognized the need for emergency intervention to prevent further deaths. The British soldiers' anger was immediate and visceral. Many had to be restrained from taking immediate violent action against the guards. The normal protocols for handling prisoners of war were strained to the breaking point by the enormity of the crimes that had been committed. Officers struggled to maintain military discipline while processing the emotional impact of what they were witnessing. The contrast between the guards' attempts to present themselves as professional soldiers and the reality of their crimes was stark and undeniable. The British forces had expected to encounter a defeated but disciplined enemy force. Instead, they found themselves confronting individuals who had participated in systematic murder on an industrial scale. The gap between expectation and reality was so vast that it took time for the full implications to sink in. Captain Derek Sington, one of the first British officers to enter the camp, would later describe the moment when he encountered Commandant Kramer. The man who had once held absolute power over life and death now stood before him as a defeated figure, attempting to maintain some semblance of military dignity while surrounded by the evidence of his crimes. Kramer approached the British officers and attempted to explain the camp's conditions as the result of circumstances beyond his control. He claimed that overcrowding and disease had overwhelmed the camp's facilities, and that he and his staff had done their best to maintain order under impossible conditions. His words rang hollow in the face of the obvious evidence of systematic murder and neglect. The British soldiers were not prepared for the guards' attempts to present themselves as fellow professionals who had simply been following orders. Several guards approached British officers and attempted to engage them in conversation, as if they were prisoners of war deserving of respect and proper treatment. The disconnect between their perception of themselves and the reality of their crimes was complete. Irma Grace was captured while attempting to blend in with a group of female prisoners. When her true identity was discovered, she initially tried to claim that she had been forced to work at the camp against her will. The surviving prisoners, however, immediately identified her and began recounting her acts of cruelty. The woman who had once terrorized thousands now found herself surrounded by her victims, with no authority to protect her. Dr. Klein was found in his office, still working on his fabricated medical report. When British medical officers examined his documents, they immediately recognized the falsifications. His attempt to present the camp's death toll as the result of natural disease failed completely when confronted with evidence of systematic murder and medical experimentation. The British soldiers' anger was palpable as they realized the full scope of what had been perpetrated at Bergen Belsen. Some guards were subjected to immediate rough treatment by soldiers who could barely contain their rage. The normal protocols for handling prisoners of war were strained to the breaking point by the enormity of the crimes that had been committed. The guards' final moments of freedom were marked by their complete loss of dignity and authority. These individuals who had once exercised absolute power over thousands of human beings were now reduced to pleading for their lives and making pathetic attempts to justify their actions. The transformation was complete and irreversible. As the British forces secured the camp, they began the process of documenting the evidence of the guards' crimes. Photographs were taken, survivors were interviewed, and the full scope of the atrocities began to emerge. The guards who had hoped to destroy evidence found that their efforts had been largely futile. The evidence of their crimes was too extensive and too obvious to be hidden. The most striking aspect of the guards' behavior during their capture was their apparent inability to understand the moral enormity of what they had done. Many seemed genuinely surprised by the British soldiers' anger and disgust. They had become so accustomed to treating human beings as disposable objects that they could not comprehend why others would find their actions abhorrent. Some guards made desperate last-minute attempts to bargain with their captors. They offered to provide information about other camps or to testify against their superiors in exchange for lenient treatment. These offers were met with contempt by British officers who understood that no information could possibly justify the crimes that had been committed. The sight of the guards being led away in shackles provided some measure of satisfaction to the surviving prisoners. These men and women who had endured unimaginable suffering finally saw their tormentors reduced to the status of common criminals. The reversal of roles was complete and absolute. The capture of the Bergen Belsen guards marked the beginning of a legal process that would expose the full extent of their crimes to the world. Within hours of the camp's liberation, British forces began the systematic documentation of evidence that would later be used in war crimes trials. The British authorities immediately recognized the historical significance of what they had discovered. Photographers and film crews were brought in to document the conditions in the camp. These images would later serve as crucial evidence in the war crimes trials and would help educate the world about the reality of the Holocaust. The systematic documentation of the camp's conditions began immediately, with British personnel working alongside surviving prisoners to create a comprehensive record of the atrocities that had been committed. The legal framework for prosecuting the guards was unprecedented. International law had never before dealt with crimes of this magnitude and systematic nature. British legal experts worked quickly to establish the procedures that would govern the trials. They understood that the eyes of the world would be on these proceedings, and that they would need to demonstrate that justice could be served even for the most heinous crimes. The evidence-gathering process was extensive and meticulous. British investigators interviewed hundreds of survivors, documented the camp's physical conditions, and collected thousands of documents that the guards had failed to destroy. The scope of the evidence was so vast that it took months to catalog and organize. Every aspect of the camp's operations was documented, from the daily routines of murder and torture to the administrative systems that had made such systematic killing possible. The guards' attempts to destroy evidence during their final hours had largely failed. The British investigators found that the documentation of the camp's crimes was so extensive that no amount of last-minute destruction could eliminate it. Personnel files, medical records, and administrative documents had survived in sufficient quantities to provide a comprehensive picture of how the camp had operated and who had been responsible for its crimes. The guards' final hours of freedom had been spent in desperate attempts to avoid responsibility for their actions. However, the evidence against them was so overwhelming that no deception or justification could possibly succeed. The British authorities immediately began preparing cases against the most senior perpetrators. Commandant Kramer was among the first to be charged with war crimes. Despite his attempts to present himself as a professional soldier who had simply followed orders, the evidence of his personal involvement in the camp's atrocities was undeniable. Witnesses testified that he had personally overseen selections for the gas chambers and had taken pleasure in the suffering of prisoners. The man who had once held absolute power over thousands of human beings was now reduced to a defendant in a legal proceeding where his victims would finally have their voices heard. His transformation from perpetrator to prisoner was complete and irreversible. Irma Gries faced similar charges related to her systematic cruelty toward female prisoners. The woman who had once terrorized thousands with her whip and her vicious dogs now sat in a defendant's dock, listening to detailed testimony about her crimes. Her attempts to claim innocence were met with contempt by survivors who provided precise descriptions of her actions. Dr. Klein was charged with crimes related to his medical experiments on prisoners and his role in the selection process that determined who would live and die. His attempts to present himself as a medical professional who had been forced to work under impossible conditions were demolished by evidence of his enthusiastic participation in the camp's systematic murder program. The trials that followed would expose the full extent of the guards' crimes to the world. The evidence presented was so overwhelming and so horrific that it helped establish the legal precedent for prosecuting crimes against humanity. The guards who had hoped to escape justice found themselves instead becoming examples of how such crimes would be punished. The Bergen Belsen trial began on September 17, 1945, in the German town of Lüneburg. It was one of the first major war crimes trials to be conducted after the war, and it established many of the legal precedents that would later be used in the Nuremberg trials. The proceedings were conducted under British military law, but they incorporated principles of international justice that had never before been applied to such systematic crimes. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive. They presented evidence of the camp's systematic murder program, the medical experiments conducted on prisoners, and the deliberate starvation and torture of inmates. Survivor testimony was particularly powerful, as former prisoners were able to provide detailed accounts of the guards' actions and the conditions they had endured. The prosecution also presented physical evidence, including photographs, documents, and artifacts recovered from the camp. The defendants' attempts to justify their actions were universally unsuccessful. Their claims that they had been following orders were rejected by the court, which established the principle that individuals are responsible for their actions regardless of the orders they may have received. Their attempts to minimize their involvement, or to present themselves as victims of the Nazi system, were demolished by the extensive evidence of their voluntary participation in the camp's crimes. The defense arguments revealed the complete moral bankruptcy of the guard force. Many defendants attempted to argue that they had been kind to prisoners or had tried to help them within the constraints of the system. These claims were contradicted by survivor testimony and documentary evidence that showed their active participation in torture and murder. The disconnect between their self-perception and the reality of their actions was complete and undeniable. The final irony was that the guards' desperate attempts to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses had largely failed. The scope of their crimes was so vast that no amount of last-minute deception could possibly hide what they had done. Their final 24 hours of freedom had been spent in futile attempts to avoid the inevitable consequences of their actions. Kramer, Grace, and Klein were all eventually executed for their crimes. Their deaths marked the final chapter in their transformation from perpetrators to victims of the justice system they had helped to create. The men and women who had once held absolute power over life and death now faced the same fate they had imposed on so many others. The Bergen Belsen trials established important legal precedents that would be used in subsequent war crimes prosecutions. The guards who had hoped to escape justice instead became examples of how the international community would respond to such crimes. Their final hours of freedom had been spent in vain attempts to avoid a reckoning that was both inevitable and just. The final 24 hours of the Bergen Belsen guards' freedom revealed something profound about human nature and the consequences of unchecked power. These individuals, who had spent years exercising absolute authority over other human beings, were ultimately reduced to cowering criminals desperately trying to escape the consequences of their actions. The behavior of the guards during their final hours exposed the complete moral bankruptcy that had enabled them to participate in such horrific crimes. Their attempts to destroy evidence, eliminate witnesses, and present themselves as victims revealed the extent to which they had lost any connection to basic human decency. The most striking aspect of their final hours was their apparent inability to comprehend the enormity of what they had done. Many guards seemed genuinely surprised by the British soldiers' anger and disgust. They had become so accustomed to treating human suffering as routine that they could not understand why others would find their actions abhorrent. The guards' desperate attempts to avoid responsibility during their final hours of freedom also revealed the cowardice that had always lurked beneath their apparent authority. When faced with the prospect of being held accountable for their crimes, they abandoned any pretense of courage or principle and resorted to lies, deception, and pathetic attempts to shift blame to others. The transformation of these individuals from perpetrators to prisoners was complete and irreversible. The men and women who had once held absolute power over life and death were reduced to defendants in legal proceedings, where their victims would finally have their voices heard. Their final hours of freedom had been spent in futile attempts to avoid a reckoning that was both inevitable and just. The documentation of the guards' crimes during those final hours provided crucial evidence for the war crimes trials that followed. The photographs, testimonies, and physical evidence gathered by British forces would help establish the legal precedents that continue to govern international criminal law today. The guards' final hours also demonstrated the importance of accountability for those who commit crimes against humanity. Their desperate attempts to escape justice ultimately failed because the evidence of their crimes was too extensive and too obvious to be hidden. The international community's response to their actions helped establish the principle that such crimes would not be tolerated or forgiven. The legacy of those final 24 hours extends far beyond the specific individuals involved. The behavior of the Bergen Belsen guards during their last hours of freedom serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of maintaining moral principles even in the most difficult circumstances. The guards' transformation from perpetrators to prisoners also demonstrates the ultimate futility of attempting to escape responsibility for one's actions. Their final hours of freedom were spent in vain attempts to avoid consequences that were both inevitable and deserved. The justice that eventually caught up with them serves as a reminder that accountability for crimes against humanity is not optional, but essential. The story of the Bergen Belsen guards' final hours continues to resonate today because it reveals fundamental truths about human nature and the importance of moral responsibility. Their desperate attempts to avoid accountability during those final hours serve as a cautionary tale about the consequences of abandoning basic human decency in service of ideology or authority. Their final hours of freedom were marked by cowardice, deception, and a complete inability to comprehend the moral enormity of their actions. The men and women who had once terrorized thousands of prisoners were ultimately reduced to pathetic figures, desperately trying to escape the consequences of their crimes. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The guards who had once held absolute power over life and death now faced the same fate they had imposed on so many others. Their final 24 hours of freedom had been spent in futile attempts to avoid a reckoning that was both inevitable and just. The final 24 hours of the Bergen Belsen concentration camp guards reveal a profound truth about justice and accountability. These individuals, who had spent years exercising absolute power over other human beings, were ultimately forced to confront the consequences of their actions when British forces liberated the camp on April 15, 1945. The evidence of their crimes was too extensive and too obvious to be hidden by their desperate deceptions. The justice that eventually caught up with these individuals serves as a powerful reminder that accountability for crimes against humanity is not optional, but essential. Their final hours of freedom, marked by cowardice and moral bankruptcy, stand in stark contrast to the courage and dignity displayed by their victims during years of unimaginable suffering. The legacy of those final 24 hours continues to resonate today, serving as both a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and a testament to the ultimate triumph of justice over tyranny. The guards who had once terrorized thousands were ultimately reduced to footnotes in history, while the memory of their victims lives on as a reminder of the importance of defending human dignity and moral responsibility. If you enjoyed this video, Please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.